After 18 years of marriage, I thought I knew exactly who I was sleeping next to. I thought I knew my best friend of 22 years too. Turns out, I didn't know either of them at all. But the thing that really broke something inside me, the thing that made me walk into that attorney's office and do what I did, wasn't the betrayal itself. It was the moment my son looked me dead in the eyes and said, "Dad, maybe you drove her to it." 3 years later, when everything they'd built together started crumbling, they both came looking for the man they'd written off. What they found wasn't the same person who'd walked out of that house. My name is Webb. I'm 51 years old, and I live in Austin, Texas, a house I designed myself. I want to tell you what happened. Not because I'm bitter, I'm genuinely not anymore, but because I spent a long time thinking I was the crazy one. I wasn't. I met my wife Sandra at a bar in Dallas in 2003. She was with a group of law school friends, all of them loud and laughing, and she was the one sitting slightly apart from the group, reading something on her phone with this small private smile. I remember thinking, who reads at a bar? I walked over and asked her what was so interesting. She looked up, completely unbothered, and said, "A case about a man who sued his neighbor over a property line dispute and accidentally proved his own guilt." Then she went back to reading. I stood there for probably 10 seconds before she laughed and said, "You're still here." I told her I'd never met anyone who made the law sound interesting. She said she'd never met anyone worth looking up for. We talked until the bar closed. We got married 2 years later. I was 31. She was 29, both of us stubborn, both of us ambitious, both of us convinced we could build something that lasted. I was running a mid-sized structural engineering firm I'd co-founded with my business partner right out of grad school. Sandra had just made associate at a litigation firm downtown. We didn't have much money in those first years. We had a small apartment near South Congress, a secondhand couch, and a habit of walking to the taco truck 2 blocks away on Friday nights because we couldn't afford the restaurant across the street. I wouldn't trade those years for anything. Our son came along in 2008. We named him Daniel, after my father. Sandra took 4 months off and went back to work, and I restructured my schedule to cover mornings. Those early years were the kind of chaos that bonds you. The 2 a.m. beatings. The panic when his fever spiked at 10 months. The way Sandra and I would collapse on that secondhand couch after he finally went down and just look at each other like, we're actually doing this. We were a team. At least I thought we were. By the time Daniel was in high school, things had shifted. Not dramatically. Nothing you could point to and say there, that's the moment. Sandra had made partner by then. My firm had grown to 30 employees, and we were doing large commercial projects across Central Texas. We'd bought the house in Terrytown, taken vacations, set up college funds. The life looked exactly like what we planned. I think that's the thing about a slow drift. It looks like stability from the outside for a long time. I want to tell you about my best friend, because you need to understand who he was to me before I tell you what he did. His name was Trevor Cole. I've known him since my second year of undergrad at UT Austin. He was my roommate, then my groomsman, then the godfather of my son. We built the engineering firm together. 22 years. The man knew every hard thing I'd ever been through. My father's death, the year the firm almost went under, the miscarriage Sandra and I never talked about publicly. He knew all of it. He was at my kitchen table more often than some members of my own family. Daniel called him Uncle Trevor. The first thing I noticed was small. Sandra started coming home from what she said were work dinners, smelling like a bar I recognized, a place called Halcyon on Congress. I knew it because Trevor and I used to go there when we were younger. I mentioned it once, casually, and she said one of her colleagues had suggested it. I didn't think anything of it. 2 months later, I was backing up my old iPhone to the iCloud account we shared for family photos. It was an account we'd set up years ago for Daniel's pictures, both of us uploading to the same stream. I was transferring photos from an old device, not paying much attention, when the sync populated, and I saw an album I didn't recognize. It was hidden, the kind of folder you have to actively choose to create and then actively choose not to share. But because we shared the account, it synced to my device too. I almost didn't open it. I sat in my home office for maybe a full minute with my thumb over that folder. Some part of me already knew. The same part of me that had been quietly cataloging small wrongnesses for months and filing them under probably nothing. I opened it. There were 340 photos spanning 8 years. Sandra and Trevor in maybe 30 different locations. Hotel rooms, restaurants I recognized, a beach I'd never been to with her. There were photos with timestamps. There were photos where they were clearly comfortable, clearly practiced, clearly not new to each other. 8 years. Daniel had been 9 years old when this started. I sat with that for a long time. I didn't confront either of them that night. That's the thing people don't understand. When you see something that size, you don't react. You go quiet in a way that's completely different from calm. I told Sandra I had a headache and went to bed early. I lay there and I listened to her moving around the house, and I thought about the structural load calculations I'd been doing that week. How you test a foundation before you build on it, how you never assume weight-bearing capacity, you verify it. I'd verified nothing about my own life. The next morning, I called an attorney before I called anyone else. She was a woman named Patricia Walsh, a friend of a client's. Someone I'd heard was sharp and discreet. I told her what I'd found. She told me to document everything, change the passwords to any financial accounts only I controlled, and not to tip my hand until I knew exactly what I was dealing with. I thanked her. I went to work. I sat across from Trevor in our weekly project meeting and listened to him talk about the load specs on the Riverside Commerce Center, and I didn't say a word. I want to tell you about that period, the 3 weeks between finding the photos and what happened next, because people assume you must fall apart in that moment. I didn't. I've always processed things slowly and then all at once, and what I felt mostly was a strange architectural clarity, like I was looking at a blueprint for a building, and finally understanding where the structural failure had been hiding the whole time. I quietly separated my personal accounts from our joint ones. I backed up the photos to an encrypted drive. I spoke to Patricia twice more, going over my options. I made no decisions yet. I just gathered information. It ended not with a confrontation I planned, but with one I didn't. I came home early on a Thursday. A project meeting had been canceled, and Sandra's car was in the driveway at 2 p.m., which was unusual. I walked in and found her in the kitchen on the phone, and she turned around and her face did something I will never forget. It was a very specific kind of fear, not the fear of getting caught, but the fear of having to finally stop pretending. She said one word into the phone, later, and hung up. We stood there. I said, "How long?" She started to say something about context, about how it was complicated, about how our marriage had problems I hadn't acknowledged. I held up my phone and showed her one of the photos. She stopped talking. Then she said, "I didn't want to hurt you." I told her I needed her to leave for the night. She argued. It was her house, too. She had rights. She needed to understand what was going to happen. I told her what was going to happen was that I was going to have a conversation with my son that evening, and she was not going to be in the house for it. Because what I was not going to do was let her frame the story before I could tell him the truth. She flinched at that. Good. She left. Daniel was 20 at the time, home for the summer before his junior year at Texas A&M. He came down from his room around 6 and found me sitting at the kitchen table with 2 cups of coffee, which was something I'd done with my own father when there was something serious to discuss. He sat down. He looked at my face. He said, "Dad, what happened?" I told him clearly and without editorializing. His mother and my business partner had been involved for 8 years. I had documentation. I was meeting with an attorney and intended to file for divorce. I was telling him now, before anyone else could, because he deserved the truth from me directly. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said something I've turned over many times since. He said, "Dad, I know this is bad, but you were never really present. Even when you were here, maybe she needed something you weren't giving her." I want to be careful how I describe what happened inside me in that moment, because I don't want to make it more dramatic than it was. It wasn't rage. It was closer to the feeling when you're load testing a structure and the number comes back wrong, this flat, factual wrongness. My son had just told me that I'd probably caused my own betrayal. He hadn't asked me what I needed. He hadn't said, "I'm sorry, Dad." He'd offered mitigation for the people who had just destroyed the foundation of his own family. I said very quietly, "Your Uncle Trevor is the man she's been with for 8 years. He was at your birthday dinners. He was the person I called the night I thought you had appendicitis. And we were driving to the ER. He's been in this house hundreds of times." I paused. "I understand this is a shock. Take some time with it." I got up, took my coffee, and went to my office. I heard him on the phone later that night. I didn't listen. I didn't need to. I filed the following Tuesday. Patricia had advised me that I was entitled to a significant portion of the assets, that the documentation I had was strong, and that given Sandra's income we might be looking at a complex settlement. I heard all of that, and I told her what I wanted. I wanted the house, not to stay in it, but because I designed structural modifications to it myself and I would sell it on my terms. I wanted my share of the firm, which we would have to negotiate carefully since Trevor was my co-founder. I wanted no ongoing entanglement beyond what was legally required to dissolve the marriage. No dramatic courtroom confrontations, no public accusations. Clean, documented, final. Sandra's attorney called Patricia 2 days later and described their client as eager to reach an amicable resolution. Patricia told me with a very dry expression. I said, "I'm sure she is." There was one meeting between the four of us in a conference room at Patricia's office. Sandra walked in and I could see she'd been crying recently. She sat down and didn't look at me for the first few minutes. Her attorney began outlining their proposed terms, which were generous to me in some ways and not in others. I let them finish. Then I said I had a few adjustments. I laid them out. I watched Sandra's attorney look at my terms and glance at Sandra with something that I can only describe as mild surprise. She'd expected me to fight harder in certain areas, to make it personal. I didn't. The goal wasn't to punish. The goal was to exit cleanly and completely, with enough of what I'd built to rebuild again. At one point, Sandra said, quietly, across the table, "What about Daniel?" I said, "Daniel is 20 years old. He'll make his own choices about who he wants a relationship with. That's not a negotiation point." "That's not a negotiation point," she said. "He's struggling." I said, "So am I." That was the last real conversation we had. The firm was more complicated. Trevor had not reached out to me since the confrontation, which told me everything I needed to know about his character. Though honestly, I already knew. We negotiated a buyout through attorneys over 6 weeks. It was not pleasant. My attorney and his attorney did most of the talking. There was one moment. One, when Trevor called me directly, against the advice of both our counsel, and said, "Marcus, I need you to know I'm sorry. For what it's worth, I'm genuinely sorry." I listened to the whole thing. Then I said, "Trevor, it's worth nothing. Please don't call this number again." I hung up and never spoke to him after that. The following 8 months were the quietest of my adult life. I was living in a rental in South Austin, a clean, spare 2-bedroom with good light and a view of a live oak in the backyard. I went to work. I restructured the firm. New name, Webb Structural Group. New junior partner, a young engineer named Carla Reyes, who had been one of my senior project managers and who had the kind of methodical intelligence that made her invaluable. We were smaller for a while. Then we weren't. Daniel didn't call for 3 months. I didn't chase it. He was processing something enormous, and I meant it when I said he'd make his own choices. I trusted him enough to wait. When he did call, he asked if we could get dinner. I said yes. We met at a barbecue place near campus. Neutral ground, loud enough that silence wasn't awkward. He looked tired. He'd clearly been doing a lot of internal work, the kind that shows on your face. We talked around things for a while before he said what he'd come to say. He said, "I talked to Mom for a long time, and I talked to Uncle Trevor. Or, I guess he's just Trevor now." He stopped, and I went back and I thought about what I said to you that night. About you not being present. He looked at me. That was a terrible thing to say to someone who had just found out what you'd found out. I was in shock and I said something unfair, and I've been sitting with that. He paused again. I also went back through a lot of memories, and I started seeing things I hadn't let myself see before, like how many times Trevor was there when you weren't supposed to be home yet, or how Mom would check her phone differently when certain notifications came in. He looked down at his food. I feel like an idiot. I told him he wasn't an idiot. I told him he was 20 years old, and the people he trusted most had been lying to him too. I told him that what he'd said to me that night had hurt, and I wasn't going to pretend otherwise, but it also didn't define how I felt about him. He was my son. He'd gotten one shot. That was different from what his mother and Trevor had done. He asked what I meant by one shot. I told him clearly, I would not tolerate being used as a backup option. I would not be someone he came to when his mother's situation was convenient, and abandoned when it wasn't. If we were going to rebuild, we were going to do it honestly, which meant he didn't report back to his mother about my life, and he didn't triangulate between us. We were starting over on honest terms or not at all. He said, "That's fair," and he meant it. Slowly, we did rebuild. It wasn't quick, and it wasn't seamless. There were dinners that were stilted, phone calls that felt obligatory at first before they started feeling real again. But Daniel was genuinely trying. At one point, he told me he'd gone to see a therapist, which was the best news I'd heard in a long time. He was working through his own complicated feelings about his mother, about Trevor, about the version of his childhood that had turned out to be different than he'd thought. That's not a small thing to carry at 20. About a year after the divorce is finalized, he mentioned he was thinking about grad school, sustainable urban development, something at the intersection of engineering and environmental policy. He'd taken a course that semester that had shifted the way he was thinking about his future. He asked what I thought. I told him that was exactly the kind of thing the industry needed people thinking about. We talked for 2 hours about it. When we finally hung up, I sat in my home office for a minute, just feeling something I hadn't felt in a long time. A clean, uncomplicated pride. 6 months later, Daniel was accepted to the program at UT Austin, which meant he'd be back in the city. It also meant, as it turned out, that he started coming by the office occasionally, and then more than occasionally, and then spending whole afternoons walking project sites with me, asking questions I found increasingly sophisticated. He had a particular instinct for the intersection between structural load requirements and environmental compliance, the kind of thinking that was going to matter enormously in commercial construction over the next decade. I started introducing him to clients. He was good in a room, better than I'd been at his age. I want to tell you about the day I found out about Trevor and Sandra, because it closed something. It was a Tuesday evening, about a year and a half post-divorce. I was working late when I got a text from an old colleague who was still connected to people at my former firm. She didn't editorialize, she just sent a screenshot. It was a LinkedIn announcement. Trevor Cole had left the firm that had my name on it, for 15 years before his name replaced it, citing a desire to pursue independent projects. What the announcement didn't say, but where my colleague's accompanying message told me, was that he'd left because 2 major clients had pulled their contracts after information about his personal conduct had circulated quietly through the industry network. The kind of quiet circulation that happens when you've spent years making yourself indispensable by being charming and reliable, and then people find out what you actually are. I set my phone down. I felt something I want to describe accurately. Not satisfaction exactly. More like the particular feeling when an engineering calculation you ran months ago gets confirmed by a real-world result. The numbers were always right. The collapse was always going to happen. You just had to wait for the structure to bear the load long enough. I learned about Sandra separately. Daniel told me, carefully, about 6 months after that. His mother and Trevor were no longer together. Apparently, and Daniel relayed this without editorializing, which I noted and appreciated, Trevor had been doing to Sandra what he'd done to me. She found out he'd been involved with someone else throughout the later part of their relationship. I listened. I said I was sorry she was going through that, and I meant it in a specific, non-sentimental way you mean it. When someone is experiencing the consequence of their own choices, you're not glad they're suffering, but you're not surprised, and you're not going to pretend the cause and the effect aren't connected. Daniel said, she's back in Austin, teaching legal writing at the law school. He paused. She asked if you'd be open to talking. I said no, not with anger, just with clarity. He nodded. He said, I figured. I just said I'd ask. I appreciated that he'd asked and that he'd accepted the answer. The house I live in now I designed with Carla, who has become, over the past 2 years, not only the best professional partner I've ever had, but also someone I'd call a genuine friend. The kind of friendship that doesn't require history, just honesty. She spotted a structural inconsistency in my original design concept that would have caused drainage issues in heavy rain and spent 40 minutes on the whiteboard explaining why I was wrong. That's when I knew she was a keeper. The house sits on a half-acre in Westlake Hills, up on a ridge with a view of the hill country. I chose it because of the orientation. Natural light all morning, shade in the afternoon, prevailing breeze from the southwest in summer. I planted the back terrace myself. Texas live oaks, a native pollinator garden, a stone pathway I laid over 2 weekends last fall. Daniel helped with the pathway. He complained about his back the entire time, and I told him that was how you knew you'd done real work. He's in his 2nd year of grad school now. He brought someone home for Thanksgiving, a woman named Claire, finishing her doctorate in urban planning. Genuinely remarkable, the kind of person who argues with you about infrastructure policy over dinner and makes it feel like a compliment. I liked her immediately. I told Daniel afterward that he'd done well. He grinned in a way that reminded me of himself at 12 years old, before everything got complicated. There's a woman I've been seeing for about 8 months. Her name is Renata. She's a physician, divorcee herself, with 2 kids in high school and a very calm way of occupying space that I find genuinely restoring. We haven't made any large plans. We're not in a hurry. After the last several years, neither of us is interested in rushing towards certainty. We both learned enough about how false certainty feels to not be seduced by it. What we have is honest and steady, and that is enough for now. I turned 51 last March. Carlo organized a small party at the office. Cake, a few clients, some of my crew, and Daniel drove down from campus and surprised me. He showed up with Claire and a bottle of bourbon I'd mentioned once, months ago in passing, that I'd been meaning to try. He'd remembered. I stood in the parking lot of my own firm and felt something I want to name correctly, because I think it matters to name things correctly. Not happiness exactly, which has always seemed too light a word for what I mean. More like rightness. The rightness of a load-bearing wall that's properly placed. The rightness of a foundation that will actually hold what you put on it. A year before everything happened, I thought I had a life. I had a marriage, a partnership, a house full of shared history. What I didn't have, what I understand now, was honesty. Not from the people around me. And maybe not fully from myself either. There were things I didn't ask and things I didn't say and spaces in my life I filled with work because it was easier than asking whether everything was actually as solid as it looked. I'm not saying that excuses what Sandra did. It doesn't. I'm not saying Trevor's betrayal was anything other than a complete moral failure from a man who had every opportunity to be better and chose not to be. Every single day for 8 years. Those are facts, and I'm clear on them. What I'm saying is that the version of me who exists now, who designed his own house, who has a partner at work he can trust completely, who sat across from his son on a Sunday afternoon and actually listened, not just waited for his turn to talk. That version was built from something real. It was built from losing every false thing at once and having to decide what I actually wanted to construct in the space that was left. I know what I'm made of now, in a way I didn't before. That's not nothing. That's, in fact, quite a lot. I've thought a lot about cause and effect since all of this happened. Not in a spiritual way. I'm an engineer, I think in load-bearing terms. Every structure either holds or it doesn't. And if it collapses, something caused that. The math doesn't lie, and neither does the outcome. What Trevor and Sandra did wasn't a single bad decision. It was 8 years of daily choices. Small ones. Repeated. Compounded. Every time Trevor sat at my kitchen table and looked me in the eye, that was a choice. Every time Sandra came home and said goodnight like everything was fine, that was a choice. What I've come to understand is that people with weak character don't usually make one catastrophic decision. They make thousands of small, convenient ones. And those accumulate into the collapse you eventually find yourself standing in. The hard thing, the thing I didn't want to face for a while, is that I made choices too. Not the same kind, not with the same moral weight, but I chose to fill silence with work instead of conversation. I chose to assume steadiness meant soundness. I mistook the absence of obvious problems for the presence of something real. That's not an excuse for what they did. It's just the honest accounting. What saved me wasn't rage. And it wasn't closure. I'm not sure closure is actually a real thing, despite what people say. What saved me was deciding very clearly what I was going to build next, and then building it. One decision at a time. A firm with a partner I could actually trust. A house oriented toward morning light because I'd earned the right to design it exactly how I wanted. A relationship with my son rebuilt on honest terms, not convenient ones. Daniel choosing to come back and tell me he'd been wrong. That mattered more to me than anything Sandra or Trevor ever said or didn't say. Not because I needed the apology, but because it showed me who he actually was underneath. The shock of that first terrible night. He's his own person. He was capable of looking at something painful and choosing integrity anyway. I didn't do that for him. I just tried, over the years, to show him what that looked like. The fact that it took root is something I'm genuinely proud of. More than any contract I've ever signed. Trevor's professional collapse, and Sandra's situation afterward, I won't pretend I felt nothing when I heard. I felt the quiet, factual satisfaction of a structural prediction confirmed. What I didn't feel was the need to say anything about it, or to revisit it, or to let it take up space in a life I'd spent 2 years carefully rebuilding. That's what I mean by intelligence in the way I think about it. Not cleverness, but the wisdom to know what deserves your attention and what doesn't. The version of me that exists now is harder in some places and softer in others. I'm harder about honesty. I require it from myself and from the people around me in a way I wasn't before. And I'm softer about time. I don't rush things anymore. I don't fill silence just to fill it. I've learned to let things be exactly what they are, which it turns out is a quieter and more durable kind of strength than the one I used to think I had. If there's anything in this story worth holding on to, it's that. Not that things work out. Sometimes they don't. But that a person who decides to build honestly on real ground, with real materials, has a fighting chance of building something that actually lasts.